Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Center for Persian Studies. It is a great honor to have our neighbor, from San Diego, Mr. Farshad Sonboldel, here with us, who is going to be introduced properly by my boss, Dr. Nasir Rahimian. But before I say so, it's really great that while it's raining, thank you, Agni, and a lot of other people have come, students as well as people from outside. I saw Firuze Duman today, so that was very exciting. She's I would say kind of native to Orange County, as we knew her for her book, Funny in Farsi, right? So she was here, and I was showing her the library, which she donated some precious books. But now suddenly you've had it, showing up from from up north, a great performer in that way. So it's really nice. And of course, Mr. Japori, Comrade Japori, the president of Mazda Publisher, who we always chase against books, goodies, and of course other professors, and others are here. Oh, it was a professor in Asheville. So it's really great to have everyone. Please, Nathan, would you do the introduction? Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Tehran is always kind. I don't know why he thinks I'm his boss. He's my boss. Nasreen Rahimi, I'm a professor of comparative literature here. And I have the honor of introducing my dear colleague, Farshad, Dr. Farshad Sonboldel. And well, I'll tell you in a minute why. It's such an intense pleasure for me to introduce him. He is the World History and Cultures Librarian at the University of California, San Diego. He earned his Ph.D. in Modern Languages from University of St. Andrews in the UK, following a master's in Persian language and literature from University of Tehran. In addition to his academic research and publications in English, he is an award-winning poet, literary critic, and researcher in Persian literature. He has published 4 books in Persian, including 2 collections of poems titled Metropolis, which was published in 2015, and Sher Boland Sharoyet, 2019, a research monograph titled گزارش نحیف جنبش ادبی شاهین در کیا 2016. I don't know when he does his job because it's constantly publishing, discussing the works of an avant-garde Persian poet from the first half of the 20th century. What I have to say about Farshad's work is that his study of Persian poetry is so against the canon, well, not against, it goes outside the canon that in the U.S. literary scene in Persian studies we are familiar with. For that, I'm immensely grateful to him. And he's he's also published an edited volume that discusses current trends in literary criticism in Persian literature titled Naqd Irad, and that was published in 2020. His recently published book, which you're going to have the pleasure of hearing about, The Rebellion of Forms in Modern Persian Poetry, Politics of Poetic Experimentation, was published by Bloomsbury and explores the evolution of poetic forms in modern Persian poetry. And I've heard his presentation. I am looking forward to hearing more. He's also editor of Mila Notes, the Journal of the Middle East Librarians Association, and to my complete pleasure, he's the deputy editor of Iranian Studies, the journal I edit, and I have so thoroughly enjoyed working with him. The Mila Notes is, as I mentioned, is the Librarian Association's book, and he will be doing this work, a Bahari Fellow in the Persian arts of the book at Bodleian Libraries at Oxford University. Please join me in welcoming Farshad.
Everyone, good evening. Thank you so much, Professor Amy, for the kind introduction. Okay. I go upstairs. I just wanted to thank you all again for being here this evening. I know it could be a little challenging for some of you, especially my friends who came from San Diego, drove all the way down here. Up. Okay. Well, the book that I'm going to talk about, the Rebellion of Forms, is more than just a research to me. It's also a personal exploration of my own journey as a poet. I have tried writing this book, doing this research. I tried to answer this question that if what I write as a poet really matters. It's been actually a very important question in my whole career that sometimes it stopped me from writing, sometimes it encouraged me to write more and get deeper into the research, and sometimes I didn't find a better way to conceptualize my ideas unless I wrote about them in the form of a poem. That's why during this, doing this research, I wrote this book, شعر بلند شرایط, which I consider as a poetic version of that research. So that's why I like to call it a verse essay rather than a collection of poems or any common definition that we can have from it, like a poetry or something. So different parts of this book, شعر بلند شرایط, it's been inspired by different parts of that research. So I have chosen to talk about the chapter of that book, which is focused on the work of Muhammad Muqaddam. And I chose this section from a poem by Muhammad Muqaddam, which inspired me to write another section in شعر بلند شرایط, which I'm going to read for you in a second. I chose Muqaddam today. I thought there might be some connections between his work and what especially Jordan Center does, because Muhammad Muqaddam, as some of you may know, is the founder of the ancient languages section at the University of Tehran. He's known for his work on ancient Iran and ancient languages. But his poetic experiments has been always overlooked. So I'm going to focus on his work as a poet, as not only just a regular poet, but also a very important experimentalist. So چنگالش در دل بچه فرو کرد، خونش بگرفت و در پیاله ریخت، با چنگال دگر رو چشمان بچه در آورد، از سوراخ خاکی دور رفت. Inspired by this, I wrote in شعر بلند شرایط: من شاعری ساده‌ام که در خودش می‌پیچد، زانوی سر به ره بال می‌کند که کتابم. کار ناشر تازه است که سر در می‌آورد از خشم و سر فرو می‌کند در چشم. من آن رضا براهنیم که ترانه‌های جهان را ریز نوشته و برده آن بالا و دارد می‌خواند، سینه می‌زند و می‌خواند و نفس می‌زند. من آن رضا براهنیم در ناله‌های آن روز صبح که ریش بلندی در آورده و ریش‌هایش ریختند و در نمی‌آیند. کتاب تازه من را اینطور شروع کن. من آن شاعر ساده‌ام که در خودش می‌پیچد. چراغ اول را تو روشن کن یا شقیقه‌ام میان دو گلدسته به هوای از آن و ناشری در چشم و یک رضا و راهی در چشم دیگرم دارم. چراغ دوم را تو روشن کن یار، و پیشانی مرا از بالای البرز بردار و دستی بر آن بذار. بگو همش همان بود که دیدی و نخواهی شنید و نشنیدی. من دیدم، من از درون دو تا باگیر فضای داخل خانه را دیدم. اول تیزی تری بر بریدش سران، بعد آبش دادم، بعد بالا را نگاه کرد، درست در چشمان من نگاه کرد و رضا براهنی را شناخت. پیشانیم را از آن بام برداشتم و 1000 بار پیشانیم از آن بام برداشته شد. So, Persian poetry has never followed a linear path of evolution of development. Since the 19th century, multiple poetic movements have emerged alongside mainstream, often engaging in critical dialogue but remaining overlooked and marginalized. Conventional narratives depict the modernization of Persian poetry as a gradual trend that basically was a response to the socio-political issues and movements out there in the real world. However, these accounts, these mainstream accounts, frequently sideline the contribution of alternative poets, the ones that I tried to explore more in their works in this book. Those who experimented with form, language, and aesthetics, often challenging dominant literary norms. In recasting Persian poetry by Professor Ahmad Karimi Haqqaq, which, as many of you may know, is the celebrated work of the canonization of modern Persian poetry. Professor Haqqaq suggests that alternative poetry has historically been dismissed because its innovations basically what they presented was far away from the aesthetic pleasure that the common readers of Persian poetry wanted to get from a poem. So it is only natural that they have been sidelined and marginalized. But he emphasized that it is very important for us to see them as the margins of the mainstream trend, the main trend of modernization in Persian poetry. What this book tries to argue is that we should not start the discussion about the history of modernization in Persian poetry by creating this margin periphery categorization. So we are trying in this book, in this research, I'm trying to show all the parallel lines of modernization in Persian poetry and show how they have affected each other, not as sidelines, not as margins and the main trend, but also as interrelated literary trend and movements. Karimi Haqqaq discusses the transition from Ba'ani, a prominent poet of the 19th century, to Nima Yushish, considered as the father of modern Persian poetry, as if it is the only natural way to modernize, to describe the modernization of Persian poetry, coming from that background to Nima as the result of that. But I tried in this book to highlight an alternative line of poets which can be loosely defined as avant-garde poetry, the history of avant-garde poetry, which starts from Yaghma Jandaghi in 19th century and probably continues, not ends, but continues in the work of avant-garde poets in the 20th century, like Kondar Kia, Hushang Irani, and Muhammad Muqaddam, that we are going to talk about shortly. Before discussing the main topic, let me briefly categorize the pioneer poets of the 20th century. Their reconstruction of literary traditions during this era involved three main groups. The first group consisted of modernists whose followers could be categorized into two subgroups: modern poets advocating for gradual literary modernization and high modernists advocating for radical changes in classical poets. The former group, influenced by Nima Yushij's early experiments with romantic themes, sought to refine neoclassical templates, as they have tried to define it, particularly the Char Pare, hallmark of the post-constitutional poetry. On the other hand, poets in the latter group, inspired by Nima's later works, post-1940s usually, embraced literary modernism as an alternative to both classical and gradual modernist poetry. Traditional literary historians refer to these two subgroups as Charpar Sorayan, or four-liners, and Nimai poets, or Charan Nimai, respectively. The second group comprised experimental artists who, though not directly challenging the literary mainstream, recognized the need for change in poetic structure. They experimented in various ways to foster a new understanding of poetic form and propose new styles to rejuvenate poetry for a new era. The most significant experimentalist poet of the 1930s and 1950s are Muhammad Muqaddam, Zabir Behruz, and Shin Parto. Interestingly, they're all known for other activities, like at least other literary activities that they have. Zabir Behruz is a well-known playwright, and also he's been involved in research again in ancient Iranian languages, and maybe his work and contributions to the Iran Kude Association with Muhammad Muqaddam is a very important part of his career. And also Shin Parto, who most of us know as a fiction writer. The third major group consists of avant-garde poets advocating for the destruction of dominance, institutionalized literary traditions, and the introduction of radical changes in poetic structures and aesthetics to foster new forms of creativity. Probably the most influential figures of that group are Tundarkiya and Kushange Irani, which have been studied in the very last chapter of this book. But let's talk about Muhammad Muqaddam as a poet who has been introduced free verse to Persian literature. It's very interesting to know that he has experimented in free verse years before Nima started experimenting with his Nimaic poetic forms. So Nima has always actually talked about Muhammad Muqaddam with respect. I was reading in Nima's notes the other day, and he was talking about Muhammad Muqaddam as someone who is so knowledgeable about the literature, but tries not to speak about poetry per se, which we'll talk about that later, how he had this period of intensely experimenting with poetic forms, and then he drops it and becomes an academic, the Muqaddam that we know. And it is important to know that he actually had tried to sign his poems later. He signs his poems by his name, Muhammad Muqaddam. Later in his academic work, he uses Mahmad Muqaddam with it, and instead of all. So, as if he's trying to show that difference, that transition. In this talk, we will explore Muhammad Muqaddam's life and career as the foremost experimentalist poet of his time. By uncovering the layers of his work, we will examine how he challenged the conventions of versification and redefined poetic expression. Additionally, we will analyze his concept of reverse, focusing on phrasal, rhythmic, and metrical techniques that set his poetry apart. It is important to bear in mind that all the experiments, as I mentioned earlier, have been happened like years before Nima's first experiments with Nimai poetic forms, and I'm just trying to skip some parts so do not repeat myself. But the backlash of his experiments actually resulted in so many attacks against him, and so he dropped basically writing or existing as a poet shortly after only 3 collection of poems, which have been published only in 2 years. So in 2 years, he published 3 books, and that was it. And the chapter that I dedicated to Muhammad Muqaddam is probably the only academic research been done on Muhammad Muqaddam's poetry, either in Persian or English. So it's been overlooked somewhat violently by the historians of modern Persian poetry. So Muhammad Etemad Muqaddam Bahman, born in Tehran in September 1908, he embarked on a fascinating journey that took him from American College in Tehran to the bustling street of New York. Despite not completing his bachelor's degree, he returned to Tehran in 1929, where he found himself translating at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a couple of years. But that wasn't the end of his academic pursuit. In 1931, he made his way back to the States. He eventually found himself at Princeton University, chasing a Ph.D. in Oriental culture and literature. During his studies as a Ph.D. student, he published his first collection of poetry, Raz Nime Shab, Rahi Chand Birun az Parde, in 1934. He actually composed all poems of this collection in a single night, after a thought-provoking conversation with a friend about experimental means of expressing thoughts through poetry. So he has this dialogue with an American friend about how Persian poetry is capable of bringing in the new concepts and the new ways of creation. And to show that friend that it is possible, he actually embarks upon a very, very interesting journey in experimenting in Persian poetic forms. Shortly after, he printed a mere 150 copies of his second collection called Bang Khurus. In May 1935, he published his final collection of poetry in the form of a dramatic poem with the title Bazgasht be Alamut, Bishtar Amad va Name Yekom. This 40-page long poem was printed in just 40 copies with an imprint stating, "This is not for sale." It was actually very interesting working on these books. First of all, I couldn't find any copy of the last 2 in any of the libraries or private collections in Iran. So I started looking around, asking people where I can find this. And I found in the notes of Dr. Shafiq Katani, which I had the honor of being his student at the University of Tehran, that he later those notes actually published in a book called, I can refer you to the book later. But the notes were taken by Shafiq Katani, where he was a visiting scholar in Princeton University. And in those notes, he mentioned that he's seen this book in Princeton University. So I contacted Princeton. They were like, "These have been vetted probably 50 years ago. So, and we don't know where they are. They're probably at the Library of Congress." Contacting the Library of Congress, we realized that they are actually housed in the University of Arizona. But it's not in the main library. So they had this facility where they stored these books that no one has ever checked out. So with a few connections, we actually got access to a digitized copy of those 2 books. So it took me about 2 years to finally see the books. So turning to Muqaddam, after his graduation in 1938, Muqaddam returned to Iran at the pivotal moment when modernist poets were advocating for their manifestos to define literary modernism. Despite the turbulence in Persian poetry, Muqaddam displayed little interest in such upheavals. Instead, he embarked on his career as a lecturer in ancient Iranian languages at the University of Tehran, where he basically founded the the department. In the early 1960s, he ventured to the United States, teaching Iranian history and cultures at the University of Utah. Upon his return to Iran in 1963, he played a pivotal role in establishing the Department of Ancient Languages at the University of Tehran. Muqaddam left a lasting impact by introducing Iranians to prose poetry, a style that blended modern Persian prose with the Western form of poetry called blank verse. Despite publishing 3 collections of poetry in 1934 and 1935, he refrained from releasing any further creative literary works thereafter. Nevertheless, his pioneer experiments in prose poetry and his daring use of unconventional poetic language significantly expanded the horizon of literary innovation during the era. Few parts. A very important aspect of like studying Muhammad's work. As I said, there is no like proper study of his work, but whenever people mention his names in the context of the history of modern Persian poetry or literary criticism, they generally agree on like that Muqaddam has been influenced by American poetry because they assume that because he studied in the United States, so they assume that whatever he tried to do was some sort of influence by American poets at the time. Especially Shafiq Kadkani believes that his work is basically an imitation of Walt Whitman's work, but he not only believes that, but also he states that the impact comes from the translations of Whitman in Persian by the early journals that start publishing translated poems, like Bahar, for instance. So of course, it is like there's no need to explain that, which is this kind of critics is a little unfair because first of all, he's been doing a Ph.D. in the United States, so he doesn't need to read a translation, the old translation of Whitman's work in Bahar Journal, for instance. But in one of the interviews that Shams Langiudi has done with Muqaddam years after, when he's like in his 80s in Tehran, because he always tries to get away from questions about poetry and literature, he asked this in the middle of the conversation. He asked this question that, what about those poems? Where they came from? We know that you were influenced by Whitman, for instance. He says that there was he denies that, and he was like, if there was an influence, it came from my readings of another American poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay, which is a contemporary to Muqaddam when he was in Princeton. So he says that I've read her works, I've thought about her work, but not in the form of poetic form, but also about how we can basically develop poetry in a way that we can express new thoughts into the poetry. So, but this connection is so strange to Iranian readers, historians, and critics that Shams Langiudi cannot even record the name properly in the interview. So he records the name as Saint Miller, something like that. In his I went through the contemporary poets with Muqaddam at the time and found actually Saint Miller. So that was just a note about how these influences were assumed while studying the works of experimentalist poets at that time. Another aspect of shaping the evolution of Muqaddam's prose poetry was its dialogue with contemporary Persian prose. So he was a very close friend of Sadegh Hedayat. Also, Nima claims that he was a very close friend with him as well, but Nima says, no one knows. One could argue that Muqaddam's personal interest in linguistics, ancient languages, and modern literature found resonance in Persian fiction written between the 1930s to 1950s, particularly in the works of Sadegh Hidayat. Like some of his contemporaries, Muqaddam's poetic experiments lean toward archaic language, themes, and even literary forms, reflecting a broader convergence between poetry and prose in the era of in the era's literary landscape. The incorporation of Middle Persian vocabulary into the literary language of this period is notable. Many essayists and scholars attributed this phenomenon to what they term purification movement or Serenevisi. This movement advocated for Persian speakers to replace Middle Persian words, sometimes made up words that sounded like Middle Persian words, um, um, with those of Arabic, Turkic, and more recently French origin words. Muqaddam's poetry reflects this linguistic trend, which is basically that gives away his background in linguistics and ancient Iranian languages. I mean, the vast number of words that he uses and the way that he can change those words and put them in a way into his poetry that sounds natural, at least, and shows that how dominant he's been on this field. Thematically, during the same period, there were notable trends of writing short stories, novels, and plays that drew upon folk tales and historical narratives from the pre-Islamic and early Islamic era, often approached from a nationalistic perspective. Among these, you may know that there are so many very famous works of this time with the same theme, like Harbin Dokhtar Sasan by Hidayat, or Maziyar, or even lesser known works like the collection of short stories called An Iran by Shim Parto and Bozorg Alavi, also Shah Banu by Ali Asghar Rahimzadeh Safavi, or Lazika by Haydar Ali Kamali. They are mostly set in pre-Islamic or early Islamic Iran, and linguistically are very close to what Muqaddam tries to achieve in his poetry. Of course, there are so many reasons that support the existence of these trends. Maybe one of them were the research works that have been done in that era, like Neirangistan or Bakhbarzaha by Hidayat and Barzad. It basically attempts to compile or gather the folk tales and pieces linguistically related to pre-Islamic languages and culture. And also the commemoration of 36th millennium was very important. The funding coming through the that special events and whatever happened around it. And also the academic initiatives, such as Iran Kude, which was very important and influential, led by Muqaddam and Zabih Behruz. Basically, maybe they were the somehow the theoric background, theoric basis of this kind of experiments. Well, in his pursuits of an unconventional aesthetic, Muqaddam ventured into three distinct realms of Persian poetics: rhyme scheme, rhythmical system, and diction. In each of these domains, he sought to distance his poetry from the established tradition of versification. In terms of rhyme scheme, Muqaddam's poetry often employs scattered patterns where rhymes occur both at the end and in the middle of verses, unlike classical rhythm rhyme patterns, which follow a predetermined template. This freestyle approach disrupts the monotonous rhythm of the poem. Also, over time, the use of freestyle rhyme transformed the narrative structure of Persian poetry, lending unique voices to different elements within a poem. Muqaddam employs freestyle rhyme to craft a poem where various characters express themselves in personalized tones. For example, in this stanza here, the semi-alternate recurrence of rhymes at the end and in the middle of the hemistich captures the playful and melodic voice of the bird. So he tries to achieve to the state of like to create basically rhythm based on the placements of the rhymes. So creating rhymes. من مرغ شوابیزم روز پنهانم و از روشنیش پرهیزم آشیانم کس ندیده هرگز تاریک چه شد بیرون پرم و خوانم. مقدم integrates both metrical and non-metrical stanzas in his poetry, resulting in compositions with diverse rhythms that accentuates different tones within a poem. Furthermore, he occasionally crafts stanzas featuring blended rhythmic systems, where metrical and non-metrical hemistich coexist. In these instances, whether the overtone of the stanza is required, the poet adjusts the syntax with the meaning by changing the disposition of phrases and rhythmic arrangement. In this example, the narrator seamlessly merges the conventional prosodic meter of the first two lines into a blended meter to simulate the movement of the bird among the trees. در باغ‌های تنها در دره‌های پربین بر شاخ درختان تکرو افراز درختان بلند پربرگ میپرم و میخوام. So for those who are familiar with the prosodic system, در باغ‌های تنها در دره‌های پربین مستفعلون فعولون مستفعلون فعولون are those are the prosodic lines which seamlessly merge into a non-prosodic line, which is Farshad Sonboldel. So this is quite an interesting experiment at the time. Let me just skip these parts because it's probably too technical about the prosodic there. Honestly, a little bit. Another experiment of Muqaddam undertakes with the traditional prosodic system in his inconsistent use of final metrical feet in the uneven verses of his stanza. Just bear in mind that talking about the final stanza and what Nima terms as payam bandi is coming into the discourse of literary criticism decades after. Like Nima starts talking about that in 1960s, and later Akhavan Salis actually conceptualizes these ideas. So yeah, well, he basically in this example, the first two hemistich represent a rather unconventional variation of the Hazaj meter. However, the final fourth foot in the first and second hemistich is scanned different. The third hemistich is shorter and corresponds to the first 3 feet in the preceding hemistich. Similarly, the last hemistich maintains a similar metrical arrangement to the third one, with slight variation in the second foot. To just like simplify what I just rumbled there, that means that he starts this line چون نیمه که شب گشت یکی پروانه مفعول و مفاعل و مفاعیل و فعل instead of مفاعیل و فعل he breaks it and by یکی پروانه he ends it, so the foot is incomplete. This is something that Nima suggests decades later, and that's actually what he tries to Nima tries to conceptualize as the way to somehow submit the meter, submit the rhythm to what the poet wants to say. So the line goes as long as you have you want to be, like as long as your the expression that you want to make goes. So it doesn't matter if it is incomplete or it's longer than the regular rhythmic system. So he breaks the beat in the middle or adds some. Mughadam also embarked on inventing metrical patterns, which is actually very interesting because even in modern Persian poetry, we didn't have such experiments until the experiments of Simin Behbahani, for instance, in 1907, with creating rhythmical systems, basically, from the which were not often used in classical poetry. So in this example, you see that even in these lines, one can discern recurring prosodic feats, which do not come together as a prosodic system in regular prosody, like in Persian prosody. So it says, اکنون نیمی شب تیره گذشته، نیمی تنم سوخته، مانده به جای نیم دگرش، یا سوخته گردد یا نه. When you hear the sound of the poem, it sounds like it is rhythmic. It sounds like it is prosodic poetry, but it really isn't. It's just made up with prosodic feats, getting like put together to maybe approximate some kind of prosodic meaning. So I'm just trying to escape these parts and get to a little bit more exciting parts. So in this section, you see the whole, yeah. This is from the Bazgash Ba'alamut, which is very interesting thematically. It is a narrative poem, rather long narrative poem about Hassan Sabbah, the leaders of assassin in Alamut castle. But Muqaddam denies to spell Hassan, its regular spelling, with a ha. So he writes it like that, Hassan, to just differentiate that historic character with what he had in mind. The story of Hassan in this poem is somewhat similar to the story of Gilgamesh. Again, another aspect of him playing with all these narratives. And it is just very interesting. It, like, the whole story changes. Hassan, who is Hassan Sabbah, is on Alamut. One day he decides to come down to the city and he falls in love. So he stays there. So which is not a historical narrative, of course, but it's very interesting that he changes these narratives to just form some kind of narration in the form of a poem, which is not very common at that time. So also, like, technically speaking about the music of this poem, he allows the speech to unfold extensively within the stanza through enjambments. Indeed, the stanzas in this poem comprise several unfinished hemistiches in terms of syntax. Then he permits the meaning to flow seamlessly from one hemistich to another without completion. This technique enables the poet to synchronize the length of hemistich with the natural cadence of the speech rather than confining it within the restricted units of traditional versification. That's exactly what Nima tries to do with his Nimahi poetry. Moreover, the rhythm of the stanza is partly a result of overloading the sentence with complemental prepositional phrases and relative clauses. برای دوری از مردم، از کارهایشان، از اندیشه‌هایشان، از آرزوهای کوچکشان، از دردهای پستشان، برای ندیدن ریختشان، نشنیدن سخنشان، بو نکردن بویشان، برای آزادن تماشا کردن نیز شدنشان، در ویرانه دژ علموت که دست کس بدان نرسیدی، که تنها آله بلند پرواز گردش پریدی و مار در ویرانه سوراخ داشتی، در همان دژی که روزگاری کلید زندگی و مرگ جهانی آنجا بودی، حسن آرام گرفت. Muqaddam employs the technique of breaking each hemistich into 2 or 3 segments by inserting pauses among phrasal groups and clauses. One could argue that this technique resembles the form of pejura, which is actually in English poetry. It's a very iconic technique that Walt Whitman uses, actually. So, but the difference is that while the grammatical nature of these groups may vary, the underlying principle by which line is divided by caesura remains consistent. Whitman, for instance, employs this technique for rhetorical emphasis, and the resulting group also poses rhythmic or prosodic significance. But in Muqaddam's work, it's not the case. The main reason is that what Muqaddam tries to achieve here is very close to what you may see in the fiction works of the time. Like Sadegh Hedayat uses this technique a lot, but he doesn't play with the position of the words on the page because the fiction doesn't allow him. But he uses long sentences where several clauses come together, like one after another, to just recreate that kind of rhythm. So, likewise, Muqaddam endeavors to establish a pattern by positioning them strategically within the sentence. Indeed, he harnesses the musicality inherent in prosaic lines by fragmenting them into smaller units that share rhythmic similarity. In some poems, the caesura disrupts the lines unevenly to delineate distinct voices. For instance, in Atash Nime Shab, the narrator's composed is depicted through longer hemistages with fewer breaks. So in the parts that he refrains using the prosodic, any of the prosodic techniques that he has used before, the placement of the phrases becomes important. So it breaks into the line. So it results into the uneven lines. But you'll see later, decades later, in the works of Ahmad Shamlu, for instance, in what we historically call Sher Sahib. So that's the main technique that also Shamlu uses to create that melodic kind of prose for his poetry. So in this example, آتش بلند می شود، تاره‌های آن بالا می جهند، چکیدن سرشک آتش و ناله آن شنیده می شود. این اشک فرشته آذر است که از شادی و رنج بیرون می آید. فرشته آذر می خواند از نو روشنیم تازه و گرمیم سوزان، از نو پریان با هم، از نو. Well, this combined language allows Muqaddam to incorporate diverse voices into his poem, each speaking in its own natural tone. The multiplicity of voices and heterogeneity among components of the literary language contributes to a more democratic poetic structure. By utilizing the entire Persian lexicon, not just the conventional literary vocabulary, Muqaddam ensures that all voices in the poem have an equal opportunity to be heard and understood. So what I'm trying to say is that Muqaddam probably if not for the first time, but Muqaddam's poem is a very first experiment in creating a space for multiple voices and music to come together. Traditionally speaking, Persian poetry does not allow you to do that because there is a set rhythmic system that you have to follow from the top to the bottom. And at this time where these poems are created, there are no other musical tradition. Like we don't have Nimai poetry yet, where it allows you to bring in different voices, different characters, and the dramatic poetry, as we see in the works of Mirzadeh Ishqi, for instance, does not exist yet. So bringing in different characters and voices and putting them in a dialogue is a very important move that Muqaddam makes here. And it results in I can say like maybe vocal kind of poetry that we don't have by that time. آهسته حسن نزدیک شد، پشت خود را به درختی داد و خاموش ماتش برد. پس از لختی بنشست و خم شد تا چهره خود در آب شوید. چشمان خودش در آب او را گرفتند و چون در چشمان خود در آب می‌نگریست، سرود پریان را شنید. وانسان سرودشان سبک و شیرین بود که حسن نزدیک بود بلغزد و در آب افتد. پری روی نیلوفر. خدای دژ علموت رو بنگرید. هوای کوه نمیخواد، خوراک و نوشاک خورده، بوی از دختر برده، دیگه تنهایی نمیخواد. پریان با هم. خدای دژ رو بنگر، شیفته شده به دختر، همچی که شد پس بهتر. و چون به اینجا رسید، حسن دید که چشمانش آذرین گشته. Well, in this section, the voice of narrator maintains equal standing with other voices and does not impose its language on the hearers. This is a stark contrast to traditional poetry, where the narrator often elevates the suppressed hidden language of different classes to a public transcript. So whatever is in classical literature, whatever the language of other characters, other objects, other subjects are, remains behind the scene. And the narrator, the poet, is the one who re-narrates them for you. So what Muqaddam tries to do is giving the opportunity to all these voices to come together in the poem where you read it, like as a reader. So the narrator lacks dominant influence over the language of other characters. Fairies are free to express themselves in their own chosen language, which is a little different even in writing. It's broken, it's closer to colloquial language. By utilizing the entire Persian lexicon, Muqaddam allows all objects and characters, regardless of their status in their hierarchy of cultural values, to possess a distinct language through which they can manifest in the poem. Even you see that he comes up with new words, like new khorak or nushak, as a, and it puts it actually in the poem very naturally, as if it is something that you may say or hear regularly, which is not the case. So it also distinguishes the voice of the narrator, as if the narrator is someone who is out of this world, who is not a regular person, who is not like a poet that you know. He's coming from that strange land where Hassan lives. So it's critical to recognize that experimental works like Muqaddams are not aimed to directly challenging tradition to propose a new aesthetic regime or literary style to follow. Instead, they seek to expand the boundaries of the genre and pave the way for modernization among avant-garde poets and high modernists. Muqaddam's most significant influence, therefore, lies in the poetry of the subsequent generation. With the groundwork laid, the following generation, alongside some poets from Muqaddam's own era, were able to erect a new structure within the space that Muqaddam, as an experimentalist, had created by dismantling the old structure. Thus, the innovations evident in Muqaddam's work represents experiments with the potential of Persian poetry. These experiments come together in the works of the next generation, especially as I mentioned during the talk, Ahmad Shamlu, where he conceptualizes the idea of Sher Safid or Sher Safid in early stages, or also in the works of avant-garde poets of the 1960s and 70s, most importantly, the Sher Digar movement, Sher Digar group, other poetry, or Mojano later. They all use the, like they all were aware of the experiments that Muhammad Muqaddam had with the language of Persian poetry and the music, and they all acknowledge that in their works. But the most important thing is that today, not the most important, but like very important point is that today we also need to acknowledge these experiments to re-narrate the story of Persian modernization in Persian poetry. It is important because by marginalizing these voices and these attempts, we somehow stopped it, like modern Persian poetry, to become even more democratic, which has been one of its first goals or like existential reasons to make literature more democratic. But by sidelining these people and marginalizing them, we are again somehow suppressing their work. Yeah, sorry, I skipped a lot of sections, so to make it less boring for you. But if it makes my talk a little inconsistent, I apologize for that. Thank you so much.